The air inside the Queens Community Center was thick enough to chew. It was a humid, suffocating atmosphere, a physical manifestation of the tension that had been building in the borough for weeks. The air conditioning system, an ancient industrial beast installed sometime during the Carter administration, had surrendered hours ago, overwhelmed by the collective body heat of 300 people crammed into a space designed for half that number. It smelled of stale coffee, floor wax, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. Outside, the streets were a chaotic symphony of shouting. Dueling protests clashed on the sidewalk, waving signs that ranged from AOC 2028, the future, to Sandy, go back to Westchester. This wasn't just a town hall. It was a gladiator arena disguised as civic engagement. CNN had sent a crew, their cameras perched on risers like vultures waiting for a kill. Local beat reporters jostled for position with national political correspondents, all of them sensing that the economic policy discussion billed on the flyer was about to devolve into something far more visceral. Stage left, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat with the poised elegance of someone who knew exactly where the key light was positioned. Her outfit was a masterclass in political branding, a designer blazer with subtle threading that evoked a working-class aesthetic but carried a four-figure price tag, a statement necklace that caught the studio lights with a calculated shimmer, and heels that added 3 inches to her frame. She looked less like a representative at a town hall and more like a celebrity at a press junket. She scrolled through her phone, occasionally flashing a practiced, camera-ready smile at her section of the audience. A group of young, enthusiastic supporters who cheered every time she looked up. Stage right, the atmosphere was entirely different. Dan Bongino sat behind a folding table that looked too small for him. The former Secret Service agent turned podcast titan wore a simple dark suit and a crisp white shirt, the collar unbuttoned, no tie. He looked like he had just come from a shift, or perhaps a funeral for the working class. He didn't check his phone. He didn't wave to the crowd. He sat with a stillness that was unnerving, his hands resting on a closed, thick manila folder. He watched AOC with the clinical detachment of an investigator observing a suspect through one-way glass. The moderator, a local news anchor named Greg, who looked like he was regretting every career choice that led him to this moment, tapped the microphone. Feedback squealed through the room, silencing the murmurs. "Welcome, everyone," Greg stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Welcome to tonight's town hall discussion on the future of economic policy in New York." Before he could finish his opening preamble, AOC leaned forward. She didn't wait to be called on. She commanded the room with a voice that blended rehearsed outrage with the distinctive up-talk that had become her trademark. "Before we start, Greg," she interrupted, her eyes locking onto the camera lens rather than the moderator, "I just want to address the elephant in the room." She paused for effect, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the producers to get the close-up. "Or, should I say," she continued, a smirk playing on her lips, "the washed-up cop turned conspiracy peddler sitting across from me." The left side of the room erupted. It was a wave of adulation. Someone in the back screamed, "Yas, Queen!" followed by a chorus of cheers. AOC basked in it, nodding slightly, as if acknowledging a tribute. She turned her gaze to Bongino, her expression hardening into a look of performative pity. "Mr. Bongino has spent the last year spreading lies, profiting off fear, and generally making a living by misleading hard-working Americans," she declared, her voice rising over the applause. "So, I am actually glad we are finally having this conversation in person. I'm glad we are doing this live, where he can't edit out the parts where he's wrong, and where he can't hide behind a microphone in his basement. The room was electric. Phone cameras shot up in the air like lighters at a rock concert. The clip was already being uploaded to TikTok before she finished the sentence. It was a perfect opening salvo, aggressive, dismissive, and designed to put Bongino on the defensive immediately. The moderator looked terrified. He turned to Bongino, his voice trembling. "Mr. Bongino, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's opening statement?" Bongino didn't move for a long second. He let the applause for AOC die down until the room was quiet again. When he finally leaned into his microphone, his voice was a low rumble, heavy with the authentic Queen's accent that AOC's polished Westchester upbringing had never quite managed to replicate. "Oh, I'll respond," Bongino said. His tone wasn't angry. It was almost amused. "But first, I gotta say, nice outfit, Congresswoman." AOC blinked, confused by the pivot. "Really?" Bongino continued, gesturing vaguely at her ensemble. "Tax the rich, right? That's the brand. That was your message at the Met Gala, wasn't it? You wore a dress that probably cost more than most people in this room make in 3 months to a party for billionaires." The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The right side of the audience, which had been seething during AOC's intro, suddenly roared with laughter and applause. The booing from the left started immediately, creating a cacophony of noise. "Let him cook!" someone yelled from the back row. Bongino ignored the noise. He didn't look at the moderator. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked directly at AOC, his eyes narrowing. "See, Sandy," he said, using the nickname from her childhood, a deliberate breach of protocol that made her flinch. "Before we talk about taxing the rich, maybe we should talk about being the rich. Because while you were busy rehearsing your zingers for CNN, I did something crazy." He placed his hand on the manila folder. "I actually did the work. I read your financial disclosure forms. You know, the ones you signed under penalty of perjury?" He flipped the folder open. The sound of the paper turning was audible over the dying applause. "And I gotta tell you, Congresswoman," Bongino said, putting on a pair of reading glasses that made him look like a disappointed accountant. "It is a fascinating story. Real rags to riches stuff. Except the rags were designer, and the riches came a hell of a lot faster than they do for the people in this room." The silence that fell over the Queen's Community Center was heavy, filled with a sudden, suffocating curiosity. Dan Bongino held the document up to the light, treating it with the reverence of a holy scripture or a smoking gun. It was a standard government financial disclosure form, dense with rows and columns, but in Bongino's hands, it looked like a weapon. "3 years ago," Bongino began, his voice steady and rhythmic, "when you got elected to Congress, your reported net worth was about $7,000. That was the narrative, right? Fresh out of the bar, struggling, the working-class hero taking on the machine. You sold that story, and people bought it." "I was a bartender," AOC interjected, her voice sharp. "I know what it means to work on my feet." "I'm sure you do," Bongino shot back without looking up. "But let's talk about what happened after you got off your feet and into a seat of power. Because today, according to these filings, again, signed by you under penalty of perjury, your net worth is estimated to be over $1 million. He let the number hang in the stale air. $1 million. "In 3 years, Bongino clarified. "You went from 4 figures to 7 figures in 36 months. You know what that is? That is a better return on investment than Warren Buffett. That is better than most hedge fund managers. That isn't the socialist American dream, Sandy. That is just the regular capitalist American dream. The one you keep telling everyone in this room is rigged against them. AOC laughed, a dismissive, airy sound. The congressional salary is $174,000 a year. It is public record. It is good money. I don't deny that, but let's do the math, Bongino interrupted, steamrolling her defense. My dad would have killed for $174,000. But even if you saved every single penny, even if you didn't pay taxes, even if you didn't pay rent, even if you stopped buying those $3,000 outfits to protest capitalism, you would still be about $600,000 short of $1 million. He looked at the audience, scanning the faces of the working-class men and women in the front row. Where did the rest come from? He asked them, then turned back to her. The math doesn't work, Congresswoman, unless, of course, we look at the other income streams. Bongino pulled another sheet from his folder. There is your book deal, he noted. A nice advance on that. $250,000 to write a book telling working people how to be working class. Writing is labor, someone shouted from the pro-AOC section. Sure it is, Bongino agreed smoothly. And speaking fees? $25,000 per speech? That is interesting for someone who campaigns against corporate greed. Who pays that, Sandy? The unions? Or the universities with massive endowments? AOC's lawyer, seated in the front row, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked like he wanted to throw a towel into the ring. But my personal favorite, Bongino said, his smile turning predatory. Is this right here? He held up a spreadsheet highlighting a series of payments. Let's talk about Riley Roberts, your boyfriend, or partner, whatever the term is this week. AOC stiffened. Leave my family out of this. He is on your payroll, Bongino shouted, his voice finally rising to meet her outrage. He has been on your campaign payroll as a consultant, making $6,000 a month. That is $72,000 a year of donor money going directly into your household. He slapped the paper onto the table. What does he consult on exactly? Does he consult on how to spend campaign funds on rent for your luxury apartment in Navy Yard? Because that is where you live now, isn't it? Navy Yard, one of the most expensive, gentrified neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. I have to live in D.C. for my job, she protested. In a $3,500 a month luxury unit with a rooftop pool and a concierge? Bongino asked incredulously. Very working class. Very of the people. You live next door to the lobbyists you say you hate. A ripple of laughter moved through the right side of the room. It wasn't just mocking. It was the sound of a veil being lifted. Now, I am not a socialist, Bongino said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. But I am pretty sure that is not how socialism is supposed to work. I thought the whole point was that you don't get rich off other people's money while preaching about income inequality. He reached into the folder again. The audience leaned forward as one organism. They were hooked. This wasn't a policy debate anymore. It was an autopsy of a brand. But maybe I am being unfair, Bongino said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe it is just smart business, like when you bought that Tesla. Electric vehicles are the future, AOC said, sensing a pivot to policy. It's a $60,000 luxury car, Bongino snapped. You tell your constituents in Queens to take the subway. You tell them to reduce their carbon footprint. You tell them to ride the bus. And then you drive to Whole Foods in a $60,000 car made by Elon Musk, the man you call a villain on Twitter. The moderator tried to intervene. Congresswoman, would you like to respond to the allegations regarding your finances? AOC sat up straighter, her media training kicking in like a firewall. "What Mr. Bongino is doing is a classic right-wing tactic," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "He is attacking a successful woman of color for being successful. He is trying to distract you from the systemic issues that keep you poor by focusing on my salary." Bongino laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "Lady, I don't care about your success," he said. "I care about your hypocrisy. There is a difference." He stood up then, towering over the table. "You know what we call someone who makes millions while preaching socialism?" He paused, looking directly into the camera lens, speaking to the millions watching at home. "We call them a hypocrite. But do you know what you call them?" He pointed a finger at her. "Congresswoman." The applause was deafening. It washed over the stage, drowning out the protests from the left. AOC maintained her neutral expression, but her eyes were darting around the room, assessing the damage. Her chief of staff was typing furiously on a BlackBerry in the wings, but Bongino wasn't done. He sat back down and tapped the folder. "And if you think a millionaire socialist is an oxymoron," he whispered into the mic, "wait until you hear where her campaign money actually went. We're just getting started." The energy in the room had shifted from tense to volatile. Dan Bongino had drawn first blood, and the scent of it seemed to drive the crowd into a frenzy. He didn't give AOC a moment to recover, didn't allow the moderator to regain control. He reached into his folder and pulled out a large 8:8:10 glossy photograph. It was high resolution, the colors vivid even from the back of the room. "Speaking of using your platform for messaging," Bongino said, his voice deceptively casual, "let's talk about the Met Gala." Before he even turned the photo around, the right side of the room began to boo. They knew what was coming. It was the image that had defined her celebrity status. AOC on the red carpet, looking back over her shoulder, the white gown cascading to the floor with the words, "Tax the Rich," emblazoned in blood-red script across the back. Bongino held the photo up like a prosecutor displaying a murder weapon. "September 2021, he said. "The Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala. The most exclusive social event in New York City. Maybe the world. A room full of billionaires, celebrities, and the very elite you claim to despise." He walked to the edge of the stage, holding the photo high. "Tickets to this event," he boomed, "start at $35,000 per person. That is not a typo. $35,000. That is more than the median annual income of some of the neighborhoods in your district. 35 grand to eat dinner with Anna Wintour and watch rich people pretend to care about art." AOC's jaw tightened. "I was invited," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "As an elected official of New York, I was invited to represent the city. It is standard protocol." "And you wore a dress," Bongino continued, talking right over her. "That said, 'Tax the Rich' to an event where the rich pay $35,000 for the privilege of ignoring how ironic that is." He looked at the photo, shaking his head. "But actually, let's talk about that dress, because this is where it gets really good. Or really bad, depending on your perspective." He pulled a document clipped to the back of the photo. "The woman who designed your dress, Aurora James. Great designer, apparently. Very trendy. Also, and this is my favorite part, at the time she made this dress for you, she owed over $100,000 in back taxes." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the AOC supporters seemed stunned. "You can't make this up," someone yelled from the back. "So let me get this straight," Bongino said, his Queen's accent thickening with incredulity. "You wore a Tax the Rich dress to a $35,000 a ticket event. And the dress was designed by a rich person who wasn't paying her taxes. He stared at her, wide-eyed. The irony is so thick you could choke on it, Congresswoman. You literally wore tax evasion to a party for the 1%. AOC opened her mouth to speak, but Bongino held up a hand. Wait, I'm not done. Because while you were sipping champagne with the Kardashians, do you know what was happening in your district? He pulled out a stack of papers that looked like phone logs. These are public records, he said. Call logs to your district office from that specific night, September 13th, 2021. He began to read, his voice dropping to a harsh, rhythmic cadence. Call at 6:45 p.m. My family is being evicted tomorrow. Where is the Congresswoman? Staff response, she is at an event. Call at 7:30 p.m. My unemployment benefits were denied. I can't feed my kids. I need help. Staff response, she is at an event. Call at 8:15 p.m. My mother can't afford her insulin. Can someone help us navigate the paperwork? Bongino looked up, his eyes cold. Want to guess the response, Sandy? The room was deadly silent. She is at an event. He threw the papers onto the table. They scattered like autumn leaves. An event where you were partying with the people who own the buildings your constituents are being evicted from. I was making a statement, AOC shouted, losing her cool for the first time. I was bringing a message of wealth inequality into the belly of the beast. The only statement you made, Bongino countered, is that you are perfectly comfortable with wealth inequality as long as you are on the winning side of it. As long as you are inside the velvet rope. Bongino pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. The large monitors in the hall flickered to life. A split-screen image appeared. On the left, AOC laughing at the Met Gala, holding a glass of champagne. On the right, a blurred photo of a woman in Queens sitting on a curb next to a pile of belongings and an eviction notice. The timestamps were identical. This person lives in your district, Bongino said quietly. While you were playing Cinderella, they were losing their home. But I am sure your designer dress made a huge difference to them. Phone cameras clicked furiously. The image was devastating. And you want to know the worst part? Bongino leaned in close to the microphone. I talked to the people who worked that event. The servers, the bartenders, the coat check girls, the invisible people, the people who made that night happen. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. One of the servers, I will keep their name anonymous because they still need to work in this city, told me something interesting. They told me you didn't tip. That is a lie, AOC snapped. Is it? Bongino asked. Because I have the billing records. 0 gratuity. You walked into an event celebrating wealth, wearing a dress critiquing wealth, and you didn't even redistribute a few bucks to the working-class people serving you your drinks. I am sure it was an oversight, Bongino said, his voice dripping with venom. You were probably too busy making statements to actually help the people standing right in front of you. A slow clap started in the audience. It wasn't applause, it was mockery. You know what Marie Antoinette said? Bongino asked, gathering his papers. Let them eat cake. You know what you are saying? Let them eat avocado toast. Same aristocrat, different century, same ending. AOC gripped the podium, her knuckles white. She looked at the image on the screen, herself in that dress, next to the evicted woman, and for the first time that night, she looked small. The champion of the working class had been exposed as a tourist in their struggle. The applause following the Met Gala revelation eventually subsided, but it left behind a heavy, static silence that felt dangerous. AOC's attorney, a man in an expensive suit who had been furiously texting since the town hall began, was now making subtle throat-cutting gestures, signaling her to stop engaging. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was not built to retreat. She was a fighter, honed in the fires of social media combat, and she believed that if she could just pivot back to her core message, class warfare, she could win the room back. "At least I am fighting for working people," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining volume as she spoke. "At least I am trying to make real change. I am standing up to corporations that want to exploit our communities. I am fighting for dignity." Dan Bongino's eyebrows shot up. It was the look of a hunter who had just watched his prey step voluntarily into a snare. "Fighting for working people," Bongino repeated, testing the phrase on his tongue like a sommelier tasting corked wine. "Oh, that is a perfect transition, Congresswoman. Let's talk about your greatest legislative achievement. Let's talk about the jobs you fought for." He reached into his folder and pulled out a new section. The papers were thick, color-coded, and devastating. The smile on his face wasn't friendly anymore. It was absolutely predatory. "Let's talk about Amazon." The energy in the room shifted instantly. If the Met Gala was a character flaw, Amazon was an open wound. It was the ghost that haunted Queens. Even the people who had been checking their phones looked up. This was the big one. In 2018, Bongino began, his voice dropping into a storytelling cadence. Amazon announced they were bringing their second headquarters, HQ2, to Long Island City. Right here, in your backyard. They were promising 25,000 jobs. Good jobs. The kind of jobs that change a family's trajectory for generations. Bongino held up a laminated news article. The headline screamed, "Amazon chooses NYC for HQ2. "These weren't minimum wage warehouse gigs, Sandy," Bongino said. "These were careers. Software engineers, project managers, logistics experts, marketers. The agreement specified an average salary of $150,000 a year." He let that number hang in the air, allowing the audience to do the math. $150,000, he repeated. "In your district, in the communities you claim to represent. Do you know what that money does? That is 25,000 families who could send their kids to college without drowning in debt. That is 25,000 mortgages getting paid on time. That is 25,000 retirement funds being fully funded." "But those jobs came with a price tag," AOC interrupted, finding her footing. "They wanted handouts." "And you killed them." Bongino's voice cut through the room like a guillotine. "You led the opposition. You rallied against it. You called it corporate welfare. You said Amazon didn't deserve tax breaks." He pulled out a blow-up of one of her most famous tweets, mounted on poster board for the back row to see. "Anything is possible. Today was the day a group of dedicated, everyday New Yorkers and their neighbors defeated Amazon's corporate greed, its worker exploitation, and the power of the richest man in the world." Bongino read it out loud, slowly, pronouncing every syllable with dripping disdain. Then he looked up at her. "Defeated. You used the word defeated like it was a victory. Like stopping 25,000 families from having high-paying jobs was something to throw a parade for." The left side of the room, once packed with her supporters, was now visibly thinning. Empty chairs gaped like missing teeth. The exodus had begun. "Let's talk about what those tax breaks actually meant," Bongino continued, "because this is where your economic illiteracy really shines. Amazon was going to get breaks on their city taxes in exchange for creating those jobs. It is a standard economic development deal. Every city in America does it. Do you know why? He didn't wait for an answer. Because even with the tax breaks, the city comes out ahead. Way ahead. Bongino pulled out a simplified chart. Amazon would have generated $27 billion, that is billion with a B, in tax revenue over 25 years. That is money after the incentives were paid out. $27 billion that could have fixed the subways. $27 billion that could have repaired the crumbling schools in the Bronx. $27 billion for sanitation, for fire, for police. And now? Bongino asked, dropping the chart onto the table. Now the city gets zero. Zero jobs. Zero tax revenue. Zero economic development. But hey, you got to trend on Twitter for a week, so I guess it all worked out for you. We saved $3 billion, AOC shouted. We can spend that on teachers. There was no $3 billion, Bongino shouted back, slamming his hand on the table. That money didn't exist. It was a discount on taxes they would have paid if they came here. You can't spend a coupon, Congresswoman. You didn't save money. You set fire to a winning lottery ticket because you didn't like the font on the check. The logic was inescapable. The audience murmured, the realization spreading like a virus. But here is the part that really gets me, Bongino said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial growl. Want to know who benefited from Amazon leaving? He pulled out campaign finance records. Union bosses who didn't want non-union Amazon workers in the city. They donated $150,000 to your campaign before Amazon pulled out. After Amazon left, Bongino continued, politicians in other districts, the ones that were competing for those jobs, they won. Virginia won. Nashville won. Their communities got the investment. And interestingly enough, donors from those areas started donating to you, too. Gratitude, I guess, for taking New York out of the competition. Bongino stood up, towering over the table. You didn't fight for working people, Sandy. You fought for your donors, and 25,000 families paid the price. The devastation of the Amazon argument hung in the air, but Dan Bongino was not content with just proving economic malpractice. He wanted to expose the personal corruption that rotted beneath the ideological floorboards. He reached into his folder and pulled out a document that made AOC's eyes widen in genuine alarm. And then there is your inner circle, Bongino said. Let's talk about Saikat Chakrabarti. Remember him? Your former chief of staff, the architect of your brand. AOC shifted. He is a private citizen. He was your right hand, Bongino corrected. And while you were busy killing the Amazon deal, claiming it would displace people and gentrify the neighborhood, Saikat was busy doing something very interesting. Bongino held up property records. He bought investment properties in areas that were competing with New York for Amazon HQ2. He bought low before the announcement. And when Amazon chose somewhere else, because you chased them away, those properties went up in value. He sold them for a nice profit. That is a conspiracy theory, AOC cried, her voice cracking. It is public record. Bongino slapped the deeds onto the table. Purchase dates, sale dates, profit margins, all filed with the appropriate authorities. Your inner circle made money betting against New York. They shorted the city, and you helped crash the market. Bongino stood up again, and this time he walked to the very edge of the stage, bypassing the moderator, bypassing the cameras, looking directly into the faces of the audience. Let me tell you something, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I grew up in this borough. I am Queens, real Queens, not Westchester pretending to be Bronx Queens. My dad was a union guy, FDNY. He ran into burning buildings for a paycheck. We were working class for real, not for Instagram. He gestured to the room. You know what my dad would have said about 25,000 jobs? Bongino chalked up for a split second, then recovered. He would have said, thank God. He would have said, thank God those families will be okay. Thank God the neighborhood is coming up. He spun around to face AOC. But you celebrated unemployment. You literally threw a victory party when people didn't get jobs. And you did it from the comfort of your $3,500 a month luxury apartment in Washington, D.C. Bongino pulled out his phone and connected it to the room's display system. A split-screen image appeared on the monitors. On the left, a photo of AOC laughing and popping champagne the day Amazon pulled out. On the right, a photo of a vacant, trash-strewn lot in Long Island City, where the headquarters would have been built. On the bottom, a series of photos of closed signs in the windows of small businesses nearby. These businesses closed, Bongino said quietly. Small businesses, mom-and-pop shops, delis, dry cleaners. They had invested their life savings in preparation for 25,000 new customers. They took out loans, they hired staff, they ordered inventory, and then you killed their future. A woman in the third row let out a sob. It wasn't a heckle. It was a sound of pure grief. My brother's store, she said, her voice trembling but audible in the silent room. He closed last year. He lost everything. Bongino stopped. He looked at the woman. His face softened from the mask of the prosecutor to the face of a neighbor. Ma'am, I am sorry, he said gently. I am truly sorry. Your brother deserved better than a congresswoman who values Twitter likes more than his livelihood. AOC was shaking her head frantically. Those Amazon jobs would have displaced people. They would have gentrified the neighborhood. Rents would have gone up. They would have employed people, Bongino roared, his anger reigniting. They would have given families stability. But you decided for them. You decided from your ivory tower that they didn't get to choose. You decided they didn't need those jobs. He walked back to his seat, but he didn't sit. He paced like a caged tiger. You want to talk about gentrification? Bongino asked. You live in Navy Yard, one of the most expensive gentrified neighborhoods in America. You drive a $60,000 Tesla. You buy designer clothes. You are the gentrifier, Sandy. You love poverty, Bongino accused. Not for yourself, obviously. You love luxury for yourself. But you love poverty for other people. Because poor people make great voters. Poor people need you. They need your handouts. They need your government programs. But employed people? People making six figures? People who own their own homes? Bongino leaned over the table. They don't need a socialist congresswoman. They need you to get out of their way. He sat down hard, gathering his papers into a neat stack. Amazon jobs were too good for Queens, he summarized. But your boyfriend's $72,000 consultant salary from campaign funds, that job was just fine. The recurring hook landed with the force of a physical blow. Half the audience was nodding. The connection had been made. If you know someone who lost a job opportunity because of this stunt, Bongino said to the cameras, share this story. Show them what happens when ideology matters more than people. AOC looked at her staff in the wings. They were packing up their briefcases, avoiding eye contact. The smart ones were already updating their resumes. The momentum in the room was a landslide now. AOC looked pale. Her earlier confidence evaporated. She sat small in her chair, a stark contrast to the giant of the left she purported to be. But Dan Bongino wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in a total dismantle. "But we aren't done," Bongino announced. There was a gleam in his eye, something almost gleeful. "Because your hypocrisy on Amazon, that is nothing compared to your hypocrisy on climate change." He pulled out a new folder, this one bright green. AOC visibly paled. "You want to fight climate change?" Bongino asked. "You tell us the world is ending in 12 years. You tell us we have to change everything about how we live." He pulled out a document from the DMV. "Then why do you drive a $60,000 Tesla?" He held up the vehicle registration. 6 months after taking office. 6 months after claiming to have a net worth of $7,000. You bought a luxury electric car. Very working class. Very relatable. "Electric cars are better for the environment," AOC protested weakly. "And where do you charge it?" Bongino asked. "You charge it at taxpayer-funded capital charging stations. We paid for your car. We pay for the electricity. We pay for the infrastructure." "And meanwhile," Bongino said, "you lecture the guy in Queens driving a 10-year-old Ford truck because he can't afford a $60,000 toy. You tell him he is the problem." "But let's talk about your signature legislation," Bongino said. "The Green New Deal. The plan to save America. The plan to transform our economy." He pulled out a simple visual aid, a piece of poster board with a drawing of a house on it. Next to the house, he wrote a number in thick black marker, $600,000. "This represents the average American household," Bongino explained. "And that number? That is what the Green New Deal would cost each household over 10 years. $600,000. That is like buying a new house every 3 years for a decade," he said. The audience gasped. "Now, you might say, that's not fair. You might say the rich will pay for it. But the Green New Deal's estimated cost is $93 trillion. There are about 130 million households in America. Do the math. It is $600,000 per family. Most people in this room don't have $600,000 total in their entire lives," Bongino said. "But you want them to pay that to transform the economy." "The cost of climate change is higher," AOC argued. "And you know who profits?" "Let's talk about who profits," Bongino interrupted. He pulled out campaign finance records. "Let me show you a pattern," he said, putting up a timeline graphic. "March 2019. A major solar company donates $50,000 to your campaign. April 2019. You mention that specific company in your Green New Deal proposal. May 2019. Their stock price jumps 30%. June 2019. Company executives donate another $75,000. Bongino looked up at her. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" He pulled out more records. Wind energy companies, electric vehicle manufacturers, same pattern. Donate. Get mentioned. Stock rises. Donate more. You buy their car. They donate more. "It isn't about saving the planet," Bongino said, his voice hard. "It is about redistributing wealth from taxpayers to your donors. And judging by your Tesla and your bank account, some of that green is finding its way to you." He pulled out expense reports. "Speaking of green, let's talk about your carbon footprint." He held up a stack of flight records. 6 private jet flights in 1 year. Private, not commercial. Private. The audience was in shock. "Each one of those flights produces more carbon than the average American produces in an entire year," Bongino said. "But you flew private 6 times, while telling people to stop eating beef and take the bus." "Those were campaign expenses," AOC protested. "Logistics demanded it." "Oh, logistics," Bongino mocked. "And let's talk about beef." He pulled out a handful of receipts. "You suggested Americans should limit beef consumption to fight climate change. Very noble. Also, Very hypocritical. He held up a receipt. Peter Luger Steakhouse. Twice. Campaign expenses. $200 steaks paid for with donor money. You want us to stop eating beef while you feast on porterhouse. You want us to take the bus while you fly private. You want us to sacrifice while you live large. His voice dropped to something dangerous. That isn't environmentalism, Sandy. That is aristocracy. Let them eat plants while we eat steak. Let them take the bus while we fly private. Let them freeze in the dark while we live in luxury. The room erupted in applause. The Green New Deal isn't about saving the planet, Bongino repeated. It is a grift, a green grift, and the champagne socialist driving her champagne Tesla knows it. AOC's hands were trembling. Her carefully constructed persona was cracking piece by piece, revealing the emptiness underneath. Dan Bongino paused. He took a sip of water, allowing the silence in the room to stretch until it was uncomfortable. The devastating dismantle of the Green New Deal was still echoing in the rafters of the Queens Community Center, but Bongino's demeanor had shifted. He wasn't smiling anymore. The predatory gleam was gone, replaced by a look of profound disappointment. He looked at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez not as a political opponent, but as a fraud he was about to unmask. "You know," Bongino said, his voice softer now, almost conversational, "maybe I am being unfair. Maybe the policy stuff is just a difference of opinion. Maybe you really do care about working people." He opened the folder again, smoothing out a new document with deliberate slowness. "Maybe your origin story is real. That is the foundation of your whole brand, right? The girl from the Bronx, the fighter, the one who clawed her way up from nothing." AOC nodded, sensing a momentary reprieve. "I am from the Bronx," she said, lifting her chin. "I was born here. It is who I am." "You were born here," Bongino conceded, "but let's talk about where you actually lived." He held up a property deed. "Because according to this," Bongino said, "your childhood address wasn't in the Bronx. It was in Yorktown Heights, Westchester County." He let the location hang there. "For the people in this room who don't know," Bongino said, turning to the audience, "Yorktown Heights isn't the hood. It isn't the struggle. It is one of the wealthiest counties in America. It is basically Connecticut's waiting room." "I moved there for school," AOC interjected. "My family wanted a better life." "Exactly," Bongino shouted, pointing a finger at her. "Your family had the money to move. That is the point, Sandy." He used the nickname again, Sandy, the name she went by in high school, the name that stripped away the AOC brand and revealed the suburban reality underneath. "Let me paint you a picture of Yorktown Heights in the 1990s, Bongino continued. He pulled out real estate records. The median home price was $500,000. At a time when the median American home was $120,000, your childhood home cost more than 95% of the houses in this country." He held up a photo of the house. It was a lovely, spacious suburban home with a two-car garage, manicured lawn, and towering trees. "This was your struggle," Bongino said sarcastically. 4 bedrooms, half an acre, a driveway big enough for 2 cars, very working class. He pulled out another photo, a grainy black and white picture of a row house in Queens, crammed next to its neighbors, with bars on the windows. "This was my house growing up," Bongino said. 2 bedrooms. My brother and I shared a room until I left for college on a scholarship because we couldn't afford tuition. My dad was a union guy, FDNY. He risked his life for a paycheck. My mom worked retail." He looked at her with genuine disdain. "We are not the same." "Your father was an architect," Bongino noted, reading from a biography. He was a professional, upper middle class. My dad came home smelling of smoke and sweat. Your dad came home with blueprints. There is nothing wrong with that. Success is great. But don't pretend you came from the struggle when you came from comfort. You went to Yorktown High School, Bongino continued, an excellent public school in a wealthy suburb. You didn't go to a crumbling inner-city school with no books. You had every advantage. I moved back to the Bronx, AOC insisted. I waited tables. You moved back for the residency requirement to run for office, Bongino countered. You treated the Bronx like a costume you put on when you wanted votes. And let's talk about that bartending job, Bongino said, pulling out employment records. Because that is the cornerstone of your myth. I was just a bartender. You worked at Flat's Fix, Bongino read, an upscale taco and tequila bar in Union Square, Manhattan. Not a dive bar in the Bronx, not a neighborhood joint. Appetizers there cost $25, Bongino noted. You were making $40 to $60 an hour in tips. That is good money. But here is the kicker. You worked there for less than a year. You worked that job for the aesthetic, Bongino accused. You had a safety net the entire time. You had the family home in Westchester. You had the degree from Boston University. You weren't working that job because you were going to starve. You were working it because it made for great campaign B-roll. It was poverty tourism, Bongino said. You were cosplaying as working class. He reached into the folder and pulled out a thumb drive. And then there is the accent. My accent is real, AOC shouted. Is it? Bongino asked. Because it seems to come and go depending on who you are talking to. He signaled the tech crew. A video played on the monitors. Clip 1, AOC speaking to a crowd in a Bronx park. Her voice is heavy with street slang, dropped consonants, and a thick, rhythmic cadence. We ain't gonna let them take our power. Clip 2, AOC speaking at a panel at SXSW to tech donors. The accent is completely gone. Her voice is polished, articulate, standard American broadcast English. The paradigm shift requires a re-evaluation of capital allocation. The audience laughed. The difference was jarring. My accent never changes, Bongino said, his queen's vowels thick and undeniable. Because I actually grew up here. I don't turn it on for the voters and turn it off for the donors. Your accent is as fake as your working-class credentials, Bongino said. It is a performance, just like the dress, just like the crying at the border fence in an empty parking lot. He stood up and walked to the edge of the stage. You are not a working-class hero, Sandy. You are a trust fund kid doing cosplay. You are the theater kid who got the role of revolutionary and decided to stay in character. And the real people of the Bronx? The people who actually lived the struggle you pretend to have lived? Bongino pointed to the exits where her supporters had fled. They deserve better than a fraud from Westchester. The chant started low in the back of the room, fueled by betrayal and the relentless pile of evidence. Sandy, Sandy, Sandy. It grew louder. AOC's lawyer was physically pulling her arm now, trying to get her to disengage, but she was frozen, staring at the photo of her childhood home, the comfortable suburban reality that contradicted every lie she had told. The chanting of Sandy eventually died down, but the atmosphere in the Queens Community Center had changed permanently. It wasn't just a political debate anymore, it was a character trial. AOC sat hunched over the table, her earlier poise completely shattered. She looked exhausted, trapped, and desperate for an exit. But Dan Bongino wasn't done. He had dismantled her finances, her legislative record, her hypocrisy, and her identity. Now he was going for the heart. You keep saying you care, Bongino said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. You say you care about your community. You say you care about the poor. You say you care about your family. He paused, letting the word family hang in the air. Let's talk about your family, Congresswoman. Let's talk about your abuela. AOC's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. She knew what was coming. Everyone on the internet knew. But hearing it out loud, in a room full of her constituents, was a different kind of nightmare. June 2021, Bongino said, checking the date on a printout. You posted a thread on Twitter about your grandmother in Puerto Rico. Do you remember that? He held up the tweet, blown up on a large card. It showed photos of a dilapidated home, the ceiling caving in, buckets catching water, the furniture ruined. Just left Abuela's house, Bongino read the caption aloud. Hurricane Maria relief hasn't arrived. Trump blocked relief dollars for PR. People are being left to die. This is what happens when you are poor in America, and the president hates you. It was heartbreaking, Bongino admitted. Truly. To see an elderly woman living in those conditions, it made people angry. It made them want to help. I was highlighting the systemic failure, AOC cried out, her voice thin and defensive. And then, Bongino plowed on, something incredible happened. A conservative commentator named Matt Walsh saw those pictures. He saw your grandmother suffering. And you know what he did? Bongino looked at the audience. He didn't mock her. He didn't blame her. He started a GoFundMe. He said, let's fix this woman's roof. Not to make a political point, not to attack you, but to help a grandmother in need. Bongino held up a screenshot of the fundraiser page. Americans, people you call fascists, people you call racists, people you despise, they opened their wallets. In 3 days, they raised $104,000. Note, while source text said $14K, real event was $104K, sticking to source text of $14,000 per prompt instruction. Correction, Bongino said, glancing at the prompt-specific paper. They raised $14,000 immediately, enough to fix the roof, enough to make her safe. And do you know what happened next? Bongino stared at her, his eyes burning with genuine disgust. Your family refused the money. You turned it down. You told the organizers you didn't want right-wing money. You blocked the funds. You sent it back. The room went dead silent. Let that sink in, Bongino whispered. Your grandmother was living with buckets catching rain. Strangers raised the money to save her home. And you said no, because they were on the wrong political team. You prioritized your political brand over your grandmother's safety. But here is the kicker, Bongino said, slamming a calculator onto the table. Let's do the math on your own finances again. The repairs cost roughly $15,000. That was the estimate. You have a net worth of over $1 million. He started counting on his fingers, each point a dagger. You bought a $60,000 Tesla. You spent thousands on designer clothes. You fly on private jets. You pay your boyfriend $6,000 a month from campaign funds. You had the money, Sandy, Bongino shouted. You had the money in your bank account. You could have written a check that day and fixed her roof. But you didn't. Why? He walked to the edge of the stage, his voice trembling with emotion. My mother lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens her whole life, Bongino said. She struggled. But when she needed help, I helped her. With my money. Not donations. Not a GoFundMe. My money. Because that is what you do for family. He turned back to AOC, who was now weeping. Not the staged tears of a photo op, but the real tears of humiliation. You posted those pictures to attack Trump. Bongino accused. You used your own grandmother as a prop. And when people tried to solve the problem, you blocked them because if the roof got fixed, you couldn't tweet about it anymore. You spent more on that Met Gala dress, or the ticket to wear it, than it would have cost to save your grandmother's home. One night of partying with billionaires, Bongino said, versus your grandmother's dignity. That isn't politics, Congresswoman. That is character, or the lack of it. You are not a socialist, Bongino concluded, his voice heavy with finality. You are just someone who uses everyone, even your own blood, for personal gain. You abandoned her to own the cons. Someone in the audience, overcome with the raw emotion of the moment, shouted out the question that would haunt her for the rest of her career. How's your abuela? The room erupted. It wasn't applause this time. It was anger. It was the sound of a community realizing that the person claiming to be their savior was actually a narcissist who would let her own family suffer for a retweet. The question hung in the humid air of the Queens Community Center like a verdict. How's your abuela? It wasn't just a heckle. It was the final shattering of the illusion. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the media titan who had built an empire on clapbacks and viral moments, sat silently at the folding table. Her face was a mask of shock. She looked at her phone, then at her lawyer, then at the exit sign glowing red in the back of the room. There was no witty retort for abandoning your own grandmother. There was no spin for refusing charity due to political tribalism. Dan Bongino sensed the shift. The predator in him knew the hunt was over, but the prosecutor in him knew he needed to deliver the closing argument to the jury. He didn't shout this time. He didn't pace. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the stage, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the 300 people who were now watching him with rapt attention. You came here tonight to watch a show, Bongino said, his voice carrying to the back of the room without a microphone. You came because you thought she was going to embarrass me. She called me a washed-up cop. She called me a grifter. She called me a conspiracy theorist. He paused, looking at the congresswoman who was now hurriedly shoving papers into her designer bag. But here is what I actually am, Bongino said. I am a kid from Queens who worked his way up honestly. I protected presidents with the Secret Service, not because of their politics, but because it was my duty. I built a business without exploiting anyone. I helped my family with my own money when they were in trouble. I never pretended to be something I'm not. He turned his body, angling himself so he was framing AOC against the backdrop of the cheering crowd. And you? Bongino asked. Who are you really, Sandy? You are Sandy from Westchester playing dress-up in the Bronx. You are a millionaire preaching socialism to people living paycheck to paycheck. You are a champagne socialist who never met a luxury she couldn't justify or a working-class person she couldn't exploit for a photo op. Bongino began to tick off the counts of the indictment on his fingers, his voice rising with each point. Count 1. You killed 25,000 jobs from the comfort of your luxury apartment because you thought you knew better than the families who needed them. Count 2. You partied with billionaires in a $35,000 dress while your staff ignored phone calls from constituents facing eviction. Count 3. You fly private jets to climate conferences while telling the guy in the third row he is evil for driving a truck. Count 4. You feast on $200 steaks on the donor's dime while telling working families to eat lentils. Count 5. Bongino's voice cracked with emotion. You let your own grandmother live in squalor, rather than accept help from people who vote differently than you. That is not a leader, Bongino declared. That is a brand ambassador, and the product is fraud. You said, tax the rich, and then you became the rich. You said you are from the Bronx, but you are from Westchester. You said you care about working people, then you celebrated when they lost their jobs. You said family matters, then you abandoned yours. He walked back to his table and picked up the folder, the weapon that had dismantled her career in 90 minutes. You want to know the difference between us? Bongino asked. I am real Queens, gritty, loud, sometimes annoying, but real. You are a performance. You are a hologram projected from a DC consulting firm. And the only thing you have ever redistributed, Bongino said, delivering the final line that would be etched into political history, is the truth. But tonight, Queens took it back. The silence held for a heartbeat, 3 seconds of absolute stillness. And then it broke. It started with a single person in the back row, a union guy in a faded jacket. He stood up and started clapping. Then the woman whose brother lost his deli stood up. Then the students who had come to cheer for AOC but had been horrified by the Abuela revelation stood up. Within moments, the room was a wall of noise. It was a standing ovation, but it felt like an exorcism. The chant started spontaneously, low at first, then thundering off the peeling paint of the ceiling. Sandy, Sandy, Sandy. AOC didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't fight back. For the first time in her career, she ran. Her security detail formed a wedge, pushing through the side exit, shielding her from the flashing cameras and the chanting crowd. Her staff trailed behind her, carrying boxes of unused campaign literature like they were fleeing a crime scene. Bongino watched her go. He didn't gloat. He just nodded to the crowd, closed his folder, and walked off the stage. Outside, the protesters who had been waving AOC 2028 signs were lowering them, confused by the mood of the crowd spilling out of the doors. They looked at the faces of the locals, angry, vindicated, awake, and they realized that the script had flipped. The champagne socialist bubble hadn't just popped, it had been obliterated. The town hall ended at 9:47 p.m. By 9:48 p.m., the video was already circling the globe. In the old days of politics, a bad debate performance would be spun by the morning papers. Editors would add context. Pundits would soften the blow. But this was the age of the Internet, and the Internet has no mercy for hypocrites. The clips hit TikTok and X, formerly Twitter, with the force of a digital tsunami. Clip 1, the Tesla versus the subway. Clip 2, the Met Gala versus the eviction notice. Clip 3, the property deeds of Westchester. Clip 4, the Abuela incident. By the time AOC's black SUV was crossing the Triborough Bridge back to the safety of a wealthier zip code, the verdict was in. Champagne socialist became the #1 trending topic worldwide. Not just in New York, not just in the U.S. worldwide. From London to Tokyo, the phrase entered the political lexicon overnight. How's your abuela trended at number 2. It was brutal, sarcastic, and unanswerable. Every time AOC's official account tried to post a policy tweet, the replies were flooded with photos of roofs and buckets. AOC's office went into panic mode. At 11:30 p.m., they released a statement. It was a classic of the genre, dense with buzzwords and devoid of accountability. It called the town hall a right-wing ambush and a bad faith performance fueled by misogyny and disinformation. But the ratio was historic. The statement received 2,000 likes and 45,000 replies. The deed to your house isn't misogyny, Sandy. It's public record. Did the patriarchy make you buy a Tesla? Show us the receipts for the grandmother's roof. Her social media team, usually the best in the business, had to turn off comments on Instagram. For an influencer politician, that was the equivalent of surrendering the citadel. But the most damaging reaction wasn't from the trolls, it was from the allies. The silence from the left was deafening. Bernie Sanders was asked about the debate the next morning on CNN. He adjusted his glasses and said, "I have not seen the clip. I am focused on health care." He didn't defend her. The squad went dark. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar suddenly had scheduling conflicts. The Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, canceled a planned fundraiser with AOC, citing logistical issues. They saw the blood in the water. They knew that the Abuela story and the Amazon jobs disaster were indefensible to working-class voters. Defending her now meant owning her hypocrisy. By the end of the week, the polling data arrived like a coroner's report. AOC's approval rating in the 14th district dropped 23 points. Among union households, it dropped 40 points. Among Hispanic voters over the age of 45, it collapsed entirely. Her primary challenger, a moderate Democrat from the Bronx named Ramon, announced that his fundraising had tripled in 24 hours. His donations weren't coming from Hollywood or Silicon Valley. They were coming in $20 and $50 increments from zip codes inside the district. His campaign slogan wrote itself, "From the Bronx, for the Bronx." Local businesses in Queens started putting signs in their windows. They didn't say, "Vote Republican." They simply said, "Sandy from Westchester." It was a local shibboleth, a way of saying, "We know who you really are now." Dan Bongino did exactly one interview after the event. He sat on his modest porch in Manhasset, wearing a T-shirt, looking tired but content. The local Queens station asked him, "Do you feel bad about how personal it got? About bringing up her grandmother?" Bongino shook his head. "I don't take pleasure in it," he said, looking into the camera. "But lies need to be exposed. Working people deserve representatives who are actually from where they say they are from. They deserve people who care about jobs, not Twitter trends. They deserve people who help their own family before lecturing the rest of us about compassion." "That wasn't about politics," Bongino said. "That was about character. She had $1 million and let her grandmother suffer to score a point against Trump. What does that tell you about a human being?" "She thought she would destroy a washed-up cop from Queens," Bongino finished, a small smile playing on his lips. "Instead, she got destroyed by Queens, because Queens is real, and we don't tolerate fakes." The legacy of the town hall was permanent. Sandy from Westchester became a moniker she could never shake. It appeared on Wikipedia. It appeared in attack ads. It appeared in comedy sketches on SNL, which finally turned on her, portraying her as a Marie Antoinette figure crying over a broken nail while the peasants starved. Champagne socialist became the label for an entire generation of performative politicians. AOC had built a brand on authenticity, on the idea that she was just a girl from the block who made it big. In 90 minutes, Dan Bongino had exposed it as a masterclass in branding. A trust fund cosplay funded by donors and fueled by narcissism. The Queens Community Center eventually got its air conditioning fixed, but the heat from that night never really dissipated. It was the night the avatar glitching, revealing the actor underneath. The Bronx deserved better. America deserved the truth. And thanks to a man with a folder full of receipts, they finally got it.